Well, good morning, everybody. This is the third session in the series for Historic Districts Coalition training. The previous two sessions, as you recall, were regarding the Certificate of Appropriateness review process. The second was about the HDRC. And today we'll be discussing design guidelines and applicable policy guides. Many of that are in draft format, but we're going to discuss kind of how they work, how they're intended to work, and how they might work in the future. Let's see here. There we go. So again, just to recap, we've had a lot of questions over the previous sessions regarding demolition review and designation. So that is the next session. So keep your questions for those for 3 weeks from now. So just kind of an overview today, policy guides. We're going to discuss kind of where they came from, how they're administered by OHP staff, how are they evaluated by the HDRC and its decision making, and how do we update them over time. Possible future updates and expansion of what we have now, the current tools. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about Windows and the related policy guide for Windows, just because that is a topic of conversation that comes up quite a bit. Just a reminder, so a certificate of appropriateness is required within several design overlays in the city of San Antonio, including Rio, downtown zoning district, view sheds. But today, the historic design guidelines are applicable only to the things you see in bold. So properties located in one of 32 local historic districts, one of our approximately 1,600 individual local landmarks, and any property that's been determined eligible for designation and is subject to interim controls. The slides have block over the slides. Is it because of my boxes? So I have the chat box. Is it moving around now? Let me see if I can move those. Yeah, that's weird. So let me put those out of the way. Better? I moved you to a different screen, so I may not see the chats right away. Okay.
There's one more block, Corey.
It'll go away.
Okay.
It does that sometimes. So there should just be a very thin bar at the top now. So we have had historic design guidelines in place with the city of San Antonio since about 2012. Prior to that, we relied on the UDC, which had adopted the United States Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. Now, those standards have been around for quite a bit and have been codified since the 90s for application for historic tax credit review. So that's how the federal government considers projects that are applying for historic tax credits. And so it's a very similar kind of evaluation that we even do locally. And so that's why as local governments and other reviewing agencies begin to start their preservation ordinances, they relied heavily on these existing standards. That was the direction from our state historic preservation offices. We have the Texas Historical Commission. And so a lot of kind of new cities and baby preservation ordinances were adopting these type of standards to inform how projects are reviewed. And so we did too. We've had them in place for years and years and years. Prior to 2012. In the UDC, we also have standards. And so we have standards for signage on historic properties. And then we also had standards for commercial infill. These were very general. And when we adopted the historic design guidelines in 2012, those guidelines actually replaced those provisions. Now we kept the sign standards as they are for a few reasons. There's prohibition language for certain types of signage. And I can go into more detail about that, but I think that's probably saved for later discussion. So an overview of the standards, there are 10 of them, and so I've broken them into 2 slides, and we don't have to read them all, but these are the basic principles that generally guide historic reviews. The first 3 are really about preserving existing materials as they are, and so there's always a prioritization for retaining original materials where they exist, and avoiding adding things that are conjectural or not in keeping with the architectural style or design or historical context of the existing structure. 4 is about sometimes we look to when we evaluate historic properties, somebody might say, oh, well, this is an addition, and so it's less historic. That might be true, but it also might be a 100-year addition, and so it may have also acquired its own historic significance over time, and in its own right may be worthy of preservation. And so that's something that is considered. Distinctive features and finishes, construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship shall be preserved. That's more in alignment with the first two. When we replace features, new features, and this is important, shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities, and where possible, materials. And so there's an understanding that material technology advances over time, and so there might be an appropriate change in materials as long as it's in keeping with these other things: design, color, texture, and visual quality. Number 7 is about power washing specifically. 8 is about archaeology specifically. And 9 and 10 really address kind of new interventions to a historic site. So new additions, exterior alterations, new construction on a property or in a historic district shall not destroy historic materials. That's a prioritization. And they should be differentiated from the old somehow. We like to say it should be the same, but also different. And there's another slide about that later. We can talk about what that means for additions and as well as infill construction. But essentially, it should be compatible, but also differentiable. And then new additions should be constructed in a way that they could be removed in the future with minimal impact to the historic building materials. And so very routinely, you can see when somebody's doing historic rehab, they're able to kind of peel away those layers that have been added over time, and everything's still there most of the time. And so we're just making sure that as things are added, there's always the ability to go back. Arguably anything is reversible, but it's a matter of how much of those original materials are removed when performing an alteration. So there's some issues with these. First of all, there's 10 sentences basically that tell us how to treat any historic property. And so there's always going to be room for interpretation, which contributes to inconsistency. So that's a concern. We also are concerned with ease of use. Generally, the people that are using the guidelines are people like you. They're homeowners, property owners, people wanting to do work to the property. And so it's important that the set of rules is easy to navigate and that it's accessible and easy to understand and has images that represent the content as well. Also, we have a local program, not a federal one. And so it's fine to reference federal standards, but in the end, the local program is whatever City Council of San Antonio says it should be, and that's informed by the people. And so we have the ability to kind of shape and manage our own program locally. And so it's important that we do have individual guiding principles that tell us how San Antonio should be preserved. And then also safeguarding the future of the program and the effectiveness of the program. If we're able, we can't always control what's happening at the federal level. And so we want to make sure that we do have local provisions in place. If something ever changes, we're covered. And so we always have the ability to manage our program locally how we see fit. And it's important that we have the appropriate guiding principles adopted by City Council. So again, I keep referencing prior to 2012. Before that, actually, when Shannon Miller became the director of the Office of Historic Preservation, one of the first things she did was work with a consultant to draft the strategic historic preservation plan that you see here. That was adopted in 2009 and has dozens and dozens of recommendations for improving the local historic preservation program. And one of the main points was creation and adoption of individual historic design guidelines for San Antonio. And so that was a big project. About 3 years later, in 2012, is when these were finalized and adopted. And you all participated. I think the homeowner fair in 2012 is when we released a substantial version of the draft for public comment. And then we worked with everybody a few months after that for finalization and adoption. But this was about a 1.5-year process of meeting with stakeholders and a task force and pulling in recommendations from the community to form the guidelines. So when the guidelines were adopted, this section was also added to the UDC. And this is language that we talked about, I think, at the last session. that applications, when reviewed, shall be reviewed for conformance to the general rules and principles contained in the guidelines. Applications should be approved if in general conformance with the guidelines, but the denial of an application can be based on any inconsistency or non-conformance with the approved guidelines. All of this is very intentional to give the city flexibility in its decision-making. We fully acknowledge that historic properties are all very different. Historic districts vary from district to district. And so there's any number of things that could contribute to how a project is reviewed, especially when there's a number of guidelines in place that may not apply to a property based on specific conditions of the site. So it gives the HDRC and staff the ability to consider what guidelines really apply to a site when it does its review. So the example I always give is there might be 5 applicable guidelines to a historic property, and 4 of them are really important and 1 of them may not be. And so we can approve a case based on 4 out of 5, or if that 5th one is really important based on the conditions of the site, we could deny it. And so that really gives flexibility in the process, which is important. They are intentionally guidelines and not standards, because in the development review world, standards are things that cannot be, that must be met in order to be approved. And so we have a board of adjustment that reviews variances, and the things that require variances are standards. And so you can imagine if almost every case that had some form of inconsistency with the guidelines required a variance, that would be a very inefficient process. And ultimately, a lot of this decision-making would be left with the Board of Adjustment and not with the HDRC, which is where we want it. So this slide is just that, the importance of flexibility. So again, there's a variety that is inherent to all historic properties. Some applicable guidelines may be more impactful than others given on the project and on the conditions of the site. It gives the HDRC greater authority over specific issues related to historic properties. Eliminates the burden of variances, and then also, and we've talked about this before, that individual historic districts can also look at what guidelines are most important to them, and can also develop district-specific guidelines that could be adopted potentially under the larger historic design guidelines. Okay, in general, any questions about what we just talked about? And just so you know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into like chapter by chapter the guidelines. I think that we're all pretty familiar with those documents. I'm going to spend more time looking at the policy documents, because that's really more about how staff and the HDRC are interpreting the guidelines. We do have a question. I explained the variances a bit more. Yes. So development standards live in the UDC, and there are things like setback requirements, building height limitations. There's usually like a numerical quantity assigned to them. And those standards are based on your zoning. So if you're in a residential district, you might have a certain set of standards. If you're in a commercial district, you might have a different set of standards. But ultimately, those must be met in order for your permits to be issued. If you can't meet them, then you have to either remedy them through a variance or some other process, but typically it's going to be a variance, and those can only be approved by the Board of Adjustment. So that's a quasi-judicial board, city board that makes those decisions. And it's very difficult to have a variance approved. BOI only checks for issues. Okay, so there's a couple things to mention. So in a historic district, the process is generally that it is trickier sometimes with existing properties and dealing with existing properties. So sites that have already been developed, like properties in a historic district, to modify and change those and still meet every requirement under the UDC. And so a lot of times it's going to be setbacks. If you look at a satellite view of a historic district, you're going to see garages and outbuildings on the property line, and that's not something that would be allowed by code today. And so as you start to modify those properties or rebuild or reconstruct those buildings, there might be issues with the development code related to setbacks and building height and things like that. So sometimes they're perfectly fine. Sometimes not meeting the setback in a historic district is perfectly appropriate and consistent with the historic development pattern. And so those do require HCRC approval, but they might also still require that variance. And so usually the HCRC in those cases are a recommending body to the Board of Adjustment for award of like a setback variance or something like that. But the issue is with guidelines and not standards. So originally, this document, the Historic Design Guidelines document, was titled Historic Design Guidelines and Standards. And we had identified certain things in this document that we thought were really important, like building height and front yard setback and things like that. And we had used different language. And so in the UDC, you'll see language like shall and must, and those are standards. That means that a project must or shall meet those requirements in order to be permitted. In the guidelines, you'll see we actually eliminated standards intentionally because of this issue, is that we want flexibility and we want the HCRC to have the ultimate discretion on making decisions for historic districts. As we use should and different language that is more encouraging in keeping with the spirit of the guidelines. And so procedurally, a project is not required to meet all of the guidelines, but it definitely should. And because of this section in the UDC, where did I lost it? This gives the HCRC authority to approve or deny something based on general conformance and not meeting 10 out of 10 guidelines. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm gonna keep going here. And I'm going to bring in our website. Let me change my screen here. Okay, you should all be able to see. Okay, OHP's website. Great. So if you go to design review, the Historic Design Guidelines is where these live. And if you're not familiar, so the first chapter, this orange cover, is just basically how to use the guidelines. And so there's some process information, very general. But really the meat of the guidelines is these next few chapters. So chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are the ones that have actual guidelines in them. So let me go ahead and open one up to kind of demonstrate what we're talking about. So this is guidelines for exterior maintenance and alterations. So this is primarily dealing with an existing property. When you go to do something to it, like repair the siding or replace siding, interventions to existing materials, this is going to guide that decision making. And so you can see, find a good example. So this is that guidelines language. Avoid filling in historic door or window openings. Avoid creating new primary entrances. It doesn't say a primary entrance can never be filled in, because maybe we'll do research and we'll find that the primary entrance is not the historic entrance. So it's going to give us flexibility based on whatever the correct and most appropriate course of action is based on the development of that property. Sorry, I need to move this to another window. Can you all still see it if I put it there? That moved to a different screen for me, but I think you can still see it. And again, these are illustrated, so there's good examples and bad examples, so you can kind of understand what the guidelines are recommending. So this is about changing window opening sizes. There's information on windows and how to repair and resources for best practices for weatherization. Guidelines for additions. Again, good and bad examples, best practices. And these are all in keeping with the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation that I mentioned. And so from that one sentence that said, new construction on the site should be differentiated from old and should be compatible, we have derived all of these guidelines that we believe are consistent with the guiding principles of the standards, but give much more detail to you all and to the users what that means. So what do we expect to see? What does the commission expect to see when it's taking action on additions? Okay. So from here, we have a few things. Guidelines, policy documents, and let me kind of explain what those are before we go into it. I'm going to switch back. Sorry, lots of switching. Share my... Okay, we're back to PowerPoint. So we have the guidelines. They were adopted in 2012. They were adopted by City Council. And so revisions to that, we require future council action. It's just like adopting development code language. So that goes through a whole public process, and then ultimately City Council adopts it, and that becomes local ordinance. So the guidelines are local ordinance. Over time, things will come up that either we didn't anticipate or the guidelines didn't anticipate or warrant clarification. And so the city has a process for how we deal with that. If you go to the Development Services Department website, they have a section on RIDs, and a RID is a rules interpretation determination. And what that is when something in the code is challenged or something comes up where we can all agree the code didn't really intend for this, but we need to write down on a piece of paper what our interpretation is so that if this comes up again, we know how to deal with it prior to a revision in the code. And so typically what happens is the RIDs are all kind of developed and approved by the Director of Development Services on an as-need basis. And then every 5 years when the code updates come around, they're usually codified. And so whatever is in the RID will usually also recommend future code amendments. The policy guides work in a similar way. They are really ways that we can expand the ease of use of the guidelines, make sure we are encouraging best practices, improving predictability in the process, and then also addressing things that aren't specifically addressed in the guidelines, but we know that meet the intent of the guidelines. And so they're not a formal set of guidelines that are adopted by City Council. Generally, staff drafts them, and then we work with the HCRC to adopt them. And it's really just kind of a document that says, here's the interpretation, here's how this is consistently reviewed and approved at the commission level, and so here's what to expect. And so it's really just about providing additional guidance where we don't have it now. So it is very similar to this RID process. They may also, just like a RID, inform future updates to either the citywide guidelines or code changes if we need to. Many of you are familiar with the potential code changes to the multifamily development issue in historic districts that we were proposing now a year and a half ago while we're waiting for UDC amendment cycle to pick up again. And so there's draft guidelines that we have in place, but in the meantime, there might be policy that we also recommend and implement. And then also we have policy guides, and we're going to go through them, that we also intend to inform updates to the administrative approval process. And so that is a code update, a code change that we're not going to go into a whole lot today, but just know that that additional level of guidance that's provided by the policy guides were related to a real kind of potential change in process. Okay, so back to the website. Let me change where I'm sharing again. Okay, I think you can all see that now. So because these were a little bit tied to the UDC update process, we actually have the policy guides here. So current projects and initiatives, go to UDC updates, and it's under documents and resources. Let me make sure you all can see this. Yeah, it looks good. So we have a whole section on NFL. I'm not going to get into that. That can potentially be a topic of a future session if we like it to be. But these are the ones we're proposing for now. Staff has drafted these, and really we're at a point where we might just finish them because they're not They're not a UDC change, and we're not going to change the administrative approval process yet, but these are still good resources to have. So we are doing fences, porches, replacement materials, sustainability, and xeriscaping. These are the 5 most common requests that we get for COAs. You may not see them on HCRC agendas as much, but for sure, things that are coming in for administrative approval routinely, and we end up being challenged by a property owner of whether or not their request should be approved administratively. These are the type of guiding documents that we wish we had. And so this is why these were prioritized. So let's open up fences. They're all in similar format. You can see we drafted this last year, January 2020, in anticipation of the UDC update process. Of course, that's been on hold and continues to be on hold. And so we haven't quite finished these, but these are useful, and we actually do share them with applicants because it is a really good illustrated guide of what our interpretation of the guidelines are. Generally, this is going to provide the best new guidance for front yard fences. The guidelines say that fencing materials should be compatible and relate to the construction method and style of the primary structure that it's fencing in. And so generally that means if something's like a craftsman house, then it's generally a wood fence, pickets. If something is a Victorian house, it's generally going to have wrought iron. That's historically what we would see, or cast iron even for some of the older houses, but nobody's building cast iron fences anymore. And so this is really telling you what the most appropriate fencing style for a house is. That doesn't mean the HCRC is bound to approve it, but it's just additional guidance and generally what our recommendations are going to be. Another issue that's come up is the location of driveway gates. Obviously, these are not something that ever really happened historically. Sometimes there might have been a gate towards the street for carriages, but a lot of that predates driveways, and there certainly weren't large rolling gates that you see now that people are requesting. So the emphasis is on enclosing the front yard as it historically might have been, a small front yard. Many times historically those were gardens and not really lawns, so it makes sense in certain districts but not in others. And we do have language in here about what types of, or which historic districts front yard fences are most appropriate in. We say here this development pattern is found in some areas, I'm sorry, not found in areas like Monticello Park, Monte Vista, Greenlawn Estates. Those are larger lots, how they developed over time, and generally front yard fences didn't make sense there. People weren't doing them historically, and so it just is a matter of what the historic precedent is for those districts. Rachel, I lost my chat box, so if we do have questions, feel free to interrupt me. It's just lost in all the windows somewhere. Okay,
We do have a question, Corey.
Okay, go ahead.
The BOA goes rogue and decides based on personal views. A while back, one board member in a case said he agreed with historic districts, but sometimes they went too far. So that's more of a comment. And then Robin asked, can you repeat that about Monticello Park?
Yeah, I'm going to add BOA to the 5th session. I think there's a lot to unpack there. We talked a little bit about it at the last session, the HCRC session and appeals, but let's touch on that again in the next, or the last session, the 5th one. Yes, fences. So this is what is drafted now. Typical conditions where installing a new fence is not appropriate include properties that do not feature any historic features or fences within the immediate block. Chain link and other non-conforming fences should not be cited as supporting condition. And so this is saying that we are encouraging people to look at what historically existed in terms of fencing in their historic district. And so if there's an area where they're just not there historically, it doesn't make sense to start adding them without that historic precedent. A lot of times people will point to chain link fences, and those aren't always historic. And so we should be looking at historic conditions and not non-historic or non-conforming conditions. And then the second part is properties within an immediate block that predominantly features long natural lawns and or a drop in slope at the public right of way. This is the development pattern for some districts. It's found in Monticello Park, Monte Vista, and Greenlawn Estates specifically. But that doesn't mean that you can't ever have a fence in those districts. It just means that there may be less chance that there's historic precedent for a fence in those districts. So this is kind of about setting expectations. Okay, moving on to porches, because I really don't want to run out of time today. Porch reconstruction is something we see a lot, especially in some districts, Tobin Hill, Dignity Hill, Government Hill. We've seen those porches modified quite a bit over time. And so a lot of people are wanting to return to wood or return to real decking. Sometimes the porch has been demolished and replaced with a concrete slab and iron columns. So some people might want to go back to the more of a traditional wood porch appearance. And so this is guidance for how to do that. We've had a lot of cases over time with composite decking, and there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. I mean, these are photos from a 19th century porch owned by the Conservation Society, and they used composite decking, and it was done perfectly appropriately. And so I think there is a way to do it, but this is additional guidance that is not covered in the general guidelines, that we believe it's consistent with the guidelines and also consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. It's just more detailed than you ever got before. So this is saying do not fully replace original decking where a majority of the wood decking is intact. That's consistent with the standards regarding original materials. Do not utilize dimensional lumber that is inconsistent. This is consistent with the standards about introducing new materials and compatibility. And so there's a little bit more information about faux wood grain and the orientation of the decking as it's installed in a historic way. We have sometimes a very simple porch railing where one doesn't exist is the best route. We don't want somebody to do something really ornate if we don't know based on photographic evidence or something else that it was really ornate. And so this is a railing detail that we have found to be really successful. It's really simple for a wood railing detail that people can now reference in this document. Replacement materials. So this one's really important, especially when we look at the guidelines. Remember the standards for rehabilitation. Remember I put in bold the language about new materials matching and visual appearance, so color and texture and composition, but exact material isn't always the priority. Especially over time, we have a lot of new materials coming online that might visually be really similar and also might be more weather resistant and sustainable than some materials available, than traditional materials that might be available today. Mostly because the quality of wood has gone down over time. And so unless you're able to secure reclaimed siding to repair your house with, it may not always be the best thing to go in to the lumber yard and buy matching lumber. We've seen somebody replace an entire side here with brand new lumber that just doesn't hold up the same way that historic lumber would. So a little information about common siding profiles found in San Antonio. The recommendation is not to fully replace siding unless the original siding is completely missing or deteriorated beyond repair. There's always going to be emphasis on kind of patching and repairing things, spot repairing. So this is a really good example of that. This photo you see on the left, the skirting had been completely lost, and so that was replaced, but the majority of the siding was still intact, and so they were able to kind of just patch and paint and retain as much as possible. A little bit about windows and doors here, mostly for doors because we don't have that guidance anywhere else. And so here's examples. Everybody loves these Craftsman doors and they're trying to put them on every style of house. And so we sometimes have to show people these pictures and say, hey, you have a Tudor house. And so it might be more appropriate to do something that's in keeping with your style, or your Craftsman door maybe doesn't look good on your mid-century house. And so these are some examples that might fit the style of your house a little bit better. So that's been helpful. As you know, we have a whole separate document for windows, and so we're going to spend the last part of the session on that. Let's go back. Okay. This one is our favorite right now, Sustainability Guide for Older Structures. There's not a whole lot in here in terms of guidelines. Generally, when you talk about sustainability, you're talking about building envelope, and then also with how you treat your landscape. There's sustainability aspects to that as well. This is mostly about getting people to have that light bulb go off over their head about, hey, maybe replacing windows isn't the most sustainable thing I can do. And this is why, as we talk about embodied energy versus operational energy. And so when you think about kind of the green building industry, it's all focused on operational energy. How do you reduce energy use? So is it your lights, it's your power usage, it's your heating and cooling. But with existing buildings, it's different. We have embodied energy that is sometimes more impactful than the results of being energy efficient and preserving some of that operational energy. And so we're really encouraging people to consider the fact that their historic building, just living in a historic house, is already sustainable. You have embodied energy in those existing materials. And when you remove those materials to replace them with something new, like a new vinyl window, there is a impact to that, an environmental impact to that. And so helping people understand that issue. So we have information about the whole structure approach and kind of understanding through energy audits where that heat loss and gain is occurring. Usually it's only a small percentage that is actually the windows, and windows tend to be the bad guys when you start talking about operational costs. But generally it's going to be your roof and your walls. And so we always encourage people to look at different strategies for addressing heat gain and loss before looking at windows. Here in our hot, sunny climate, radiant barrier is really effective. And we're actually relying on here, retrofit strategies, we're relying on previous work that was done by UTSA. And so they have a whole report and study that's been done where they actually did a few case studies here in San Antonio and found what works best. And it's all kind of bang for the buck. So yeah, you can spend a lot of money doing a lot of things, but if you have $2,000 to put towards it, what is the best way to spend that money? And so it's really going to be your roof and attic. And so there's guidance for that. Repair versus replace. When it makes sense to bring new materials into your historic property and understanding the environmental impact of that. And then this is also tying into our deconstruction initiative, focusing on looking for the availability of reclaimed materials and salvaged materials for use in your historic structure. Solar panels. So there's always going to be disagreement on this, but this is our position. And I mean, we aren't changing this. Like, this is what our guidelines say now. A lot of people are under the impression that the guidelines require that solar panels not be visible ever. And that's just not what they say. Obviously, we try as hard as we can to get people to place them towards the rear of their property because they're less visible. But you can see here in the yellow box, it says, if necessary, if there's nowhere else to put them, then the HCRC can consider panels that are visible from the right-of-way. But we have some standard stipulations that we require. They must be flush with the roof. They can't be on stilts or angled like you sometimes see. They must be set back from the roof eaves a certain amount. And so there's right ways and wrong ways to do it. White roofs, and so this is actually tying into the city's Under One Roof program, which is a housing program, a roof replacement program for qualified homeowners. But as those roofs are replaced, they're using a lighter color roof, sometimes white. It's kind of like a light gray shingle many times. And what this does is it contributes to reflectivity of heat from the roof, and so it's going to reduce the overall heat island effect potentially if there's a lot of roofs that do this. And so we are applying our guidelines, and generally we are not very picky about color. And also historically, if you look, you can see that white roofs and roll-on coatings for metal roofs were used historically the same way. And so in some cases, it is perfectly appropriate. And then I mentioned xeriscaping here, and we do touch on it, but there is a whole separate document for xeriscaping. And this is Stephanie Phillips, one of our senior historic preservation specialists, did a really great job, I think, of explaining why it's important when you xeriscape not to just replace your landscape with hardscape or with rock. And the reason is heat island and pollinators. And while reduction of water is good, water usage is good, there's ways to do it that still incorporate native and xeric plant species that don't contribute to those two things, the heat island effect and the mass loss of pollinators, which is very bad locally. So do not do this. This needs to be a red, not a green. This is still draft. And then what the guidelines say is you can replace up to 50% of your front yard space with hardscaping. You can replace the whole thing with something that's not a lawn as long as you're incorporating ground cover and plantings. So another way to phrase it is we require at least 50% of green space in your yard. So this is a example where half of it is retained as lawn and the other half is landscaped bed. But really the guidelines allow for the whole thing to be replaced as landscape bed, provided that when you look at the actual coverage of the plants, that it's around 50%. Rachel, did we have a question come in?
We did. So Barbara asked if the document interfaced with Neighborhood and Housing Services funds for repair programs. Which I think you addressed that with the Under One Roof program. And then Monica, oh, go ahead. A
little bit. I mean, it's really separate unless the qualifying property is in a historic district. And we have, they are familiar with this document. We've also shown this to our Office of Sustainability. And so there's definitely interest in making sure that city programs are sustainable. And we actually are working on neighborhoods actually on a few kind of pilot projects that, right, not just the roof program, but like owner occupied rehab. So we're actually working with neighborhoods on a pilot project to show kind of like a true kind of historic rehabilitation versus what they would normally do under that program, which is replace a lot of the original materials with vinyl windows and new siding. And so that's going to be kind of a case study to demonstrate just that, is what is kind of the overall difference between doing something that's more of a historic rehab versus a traditional rehab. But did that answer that question? What was Monica's question?
And Monica asked, is the homeowner affair segment that was done on Xeriscaping available for public viewing? And she says everyone needs to watch that.
Well, I know we streamed it. I think it is. I mean, Stephanie, can you chime in? I think it probably is on the homeowner affair website.
Yeah, it should be on the website, and it was also live streamed to our Facebook page. So it's either on the San Antonio Rehabber Club Facebook page and the OHP Facebook page, but we can find that link and send it.
Yeah, we'll do that. Do landscape guides mess with the SAWS water saver program? Yes. So we actually worked very, I don't know what the best word is, but very intensely with SAWS when the guidelines were drafted in 2012. And so this is very much something that works under that program and under those recommendations. Okay. So those are the drafts. I'm going to skip windows for now because we'll look at the existing window and then we'll look at the updates. Any questions on these drafts? And so, like I said, this was all kind of paused. Actually, we really launched this website that you see now in March of last year. And then the whole process kind of came to a halt because of COVID, and we wanted to make sure that the city wasn't continuing this public input process when it was really questionable about how we would continue doing public input. And so the UDC process is still on hold. And so we haven't really made any progress on these, but I think what we will probably do is go ahead and finalize these drafts. These technically don't need to go to City Council. They're not UDC amendments, they're just the policy documents. What would be a UDC change is we start changing how we review things for administrative approval based on these. So it makes sense to go ahead and implement these because they are useful documents just in terms of guidance for people. And so that's something to maybe look for the next few months, and we'll work with this group and with the general public on finalizing those. It'll go to HGRC for adoption. Okay, I'm going back to my PowerPoint. Okay, Windows. So there's a few ways that we look at Windows, and they're not all the same. So we hear from time to time that there's angst about new construction not being held to the same window standards as historic houses. And not that there's not standards, but this is kind of the distinction. As we look at windows in terms of existing windows, and this is what the guidelines say, is install new windows to match the historic or existing windows in terms of size, type, configuration, material, form, appearance, and detail when original windows are deteriorated beyond repair. That's the only guidance we have for existing windows, really. And you can see there's all these different manufacturers of windows. And so there's potentially a large variety of potential replacements that could be evaluated, and they're all going to be evaluated a little bit differently based on several things, but I'll get back to that. The new construction, the guidelines give us this sentence, and it's not even specifically about windows. It just says use materials that complement the type, color, texture of materials traditionally found in the district. Materials should not be so dissimilar to distract from the historic interpretation of the district, and it says something else, but this is really it. And so you can imagine you have dozens and dozens of infill projects, new construction cases. They're all using different windows. And so this is something that we really ran into about 2015, 2016. We didn't have a whole lot of new construction cases before then, but now we do. And we're getting a lot of variation in the types of windows and types that are being requested. And so we very quickly put together a window policy to help us be more consistent in that decision making. Generally, we want to make sure that the windows used in new construction are equal to the quality of windows you would find historically. That doesn't mean that the material has to match, but that means that the type, color, and texture of materials has to match. That's what the guidelines say. So these are the different scenarios. We have existing buildings with windows intact. We have existing buildings where the windows may not be intact. Either they've been previously replaced with aluminum windows, they might be missing. There's plenty of houses still that have not been rehabilitated that just don't even have windows. And so what is the best practice for those? Or major components are missing. Maybe there's a frame, but there's not a sash, or there's just major components of window missing. Then there's windows and additions. And so you've got guidelines that say new additions should be differentiated from existing. Well, what does that mean about windows? We have our interpretation, and I'll explain that a little bit, but just know that that's a different condition. Then new construction is the fourth condition. So completely new building, what should those windows be? So just know when this is our policy and our interpretation is when they're intact, meaning there is a window there that is the majority of its materials are still extant, we're almost always going to require repair. It doesn't mean that the materials that are there all have to stay there. It might mean some materials have to come out and go back in, meaning new or salvage replacement sashes even, or a reconstructed frame, or replaced glass and hardware, but that's always going to be considered repair, because at the end of the day, when the project is done, it's going to be the same materials and kind of construction technique as what was there historically. Replacement is when all that comes out, so you rip out the sash, you rip out the window weights, you reframe the window, and you stick in a replacement product, an insert window. And so that is considered replacement. And so we are very careful about when full replacement like that is warranted. And generally it's going to mean that a window is definitely beyond repair. The original materials are gone or mostly gone to where replacement is warranted. So let me switch back my my window here. So back to design guidelines. This is the window policy document that we've had in place since 2015. It's crazy that we've had it for that long at this point. Yeah, December 20, so about, yeah, 5 years. More information about replacement versus repair. And this aligns with the sustainability document that I shared, retrofitting solutions, addressing issues related to the whole envelope before you look at windows. This resonates with some people, but oftentimes, no, I'm not as good of a salesperson as a Window World salesperson, unfortunately. So people are really convinced that they need these vinyl windows most of the time. And so we do work with them. We share on this document. This is, so what we've done is we've taken those very simple sentences found in the historic design guidelines. So this is the one that was in the slide. Install new windows to match historic or existing. And what we've done is we've expanded on that. Like, what does that mean? And so we've added some guidance here in terms of the type of glass that should be used, the type of dimension and profiling, window trim detail. For new construction, the same thing. We took this simple sentence, use materials that are complementary to the style, to the type, color, and texture of existing materials. And we've explained what does that mean. So in new construction, like we found that this block frame type window and a double hung sash window tend to look more like or be more consistent with a historic window than something like this. This is just a vinyl window with a fixed sash and a nailing strip. So it's very flush with the exterior envelope of the building. Because the top sash is not operable, it's usually in the same plane as this extruded frame around it, so you lose that sense of depth and dimension to the window. There's also a few resources at the end of this. So this is helping somebody fill out a window schedule, determine the extent of replacement that may be warranted for their property. And then when they are replacing, they can fill out this little comparison sheet to help them understand how the different dimensions and detailing are going to vary from what they have now. So this was a start. This was 2015, and since we've expanded on it. So I'm actually going to go back now, back to the UDC update page, to the updated window document. And this really is a much better document than we had. Again, it repeats this information. Again, this expands on what I just discussed about repairable versus beyond repair. And so beyond repair would be missing components such as, or entire units such as sashes, extreme wood rot, or where 50% more of the windows components must be reconstructed, then a replacement might be warranted. Ricky, did you have a question? I'm gonna mute you if you don't mind. I don't think you're there. And so what if you've been following HCRC for the past 3 years at this point, we have really developed our cut and paste language regarding windows. So like I said, we always try to be very consistent. And so this is how we do it. This is the language that we use on every case that involves window replacement. So there's details about the materials, the sashes, the depth, the trim, the glazing, the color, and the installation. This is copy and pasted into every HCRC case for window replacement, so that it's evaluated the same. There's typos in this, so it is very much a draft still. Previously, we did not have a lot of guidance for steel casement windows, and so we plan on adding that here. That's for you, Gemma. Windows for new construction and additions. And so again, we have these same kind of standard stipulations, but they're modified a little bit to reference new construction. And so what we always say now in every HCRC recommendation for new construction is new windows on additions should relate. This is actually additions and construction, but there's a distinction here. So new windows on addition should relate to the windows of the primary historic structure in terms of materiality and overall appearance. So we do say for additions that the material should be similar to what is found historically on the property. Windows in new construction should be similar in appearance to those commonly found within the district in terms of size, profile, and configuration. What we don't require is a specific material. And so we say, well, no material is expressly prohibited by the historic design guidelines. A high quality wood or aluminum clad wood window product often is found to meet the guidelines with the stipulations listed below. Whole window systems should match the size of historic windows on the property unless otherwise approved. And so what we've done is we've provided sizing recommendations, dimension recommendations for the actual like window components, depth installation, trim detail, type of glazing, color of the product. This is something that we've been pretty consistent on is if it's a wood window, it should be painted. If it's a clad product, like an aluminum clad product or an aluminum product, or sometimes a vinyl product if approved, then it can't be the manufacturer white or metallic finish. It has to be a darker color. And the reason for that is kind of what you see on the screen is you've got this darker window that mimics the appearance of a painted wood window. But because it's the darker color and because it's not that white, it tends to visually play a trick where it's more recessed in appearance than a white one would be. Those white windows tend to be more plasticky or metal in appearance. And so that's what we're trying to kind of achieve here. What we have found is that most manufacturers do have multiple colors and that people are opting for the darker colors just because they do look nicer. So fortunately, we haven't had to argue with people too much about the window color thing. And then installation, we do encourage block frame, which is a type of window configuration where it's actually set within the opening versus being nailed to the exterior of like where the trim is. And that's it for windows. Did we have, I saw several questions come in, Stephanie or Rachel.
Yeah, so earlier Monica asked, did the HDRC get the same direction on the importance of existing building window materials and your prioritization of those parts?
Yes, I mean, we did a very similar, we did a training with very similar information last year. Not all of them attended that. But generally, yes, like most of the commissioners do support retaining original materials in place. If we've done a site visit and we've recommended repair, generally they follow staff's lead on that. The issue is work without approval. And so very often those windows are pulled out and thrown in the garbage. And so they tend to be more likely to approve a full replacement product. What we usually recommend is what somebody said in the comments is go to Picker's Paradise and get some sashes and put them back. Like you can still do that. But it is unfortunately kind of a shortcut to a full replacement product that some people end up being successful at. Not always, but yes, that is true. Old millwork is no longer produced and unlikely to be found. How can we replace posts and railings or framing? It's true. Like we try not to ever require something to be custom produced, and many times they don't have to be. Back to the siding. Let's see. Let me go back here real quick. Sorry. Let me zoom in here. These siding profiles, 117 and 105, these are ones you can get at Home Depot a lot of times. I'm not saying you should. There's also TWC, which is a millwork place in town, produces the 109. Many times these are all able to be found at salvage places as well, if you want a higher quality wood. Something outside of that that's less common is probably a custom mill. And so we do work with people to get something similar if it's cost prohibitive to do that. It just really is a case-by-case basis and depends on what the siding is, how close it is to one of these common profiles, in all of those issues. How do we replace posts and railings and framing? And with the posts and railings, it's difficult. I mean, we've had people able to find like matching balustrades and things like that. It's just not always possible. Oh, some of these have already been answered. I'm sorry, I'm not caught up. Okay, I think that's all the questions. Sorry, I'm lost in all my screens here. Well, we finished this one a little bit early. Are there any other issues related to design guidelines or related policy documents that we want to get into? I see, Barbara, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I wanted to ask about the individual historic district guidelines. You have anything to say about that? Right? Is that the next agenda?
Well, I mean, it just depends on what individual districts want. Like, what are they trying to accomplish? It might be something small, it might be something big. When we took the citywide guidelines in 2012, we always said that district-specific guidelines could be adopted as basically appendices to the citywide. And so there was always the availability to do that. And we do have them for a couple of districts. We have them for the Brooks School of Aerospace Medicine, which is very specific and really has already been fully implemented. University of the Incarnate Word has put in a medical campus down there in those buildings. And so a lot of the buildings have been rehabbed already under that set of guidelines, and really it's been successful. And then you will recall we did this a couple of years ago for the Mission Historic District. And so that was really to tackle the problem of what do we do with such a large district with such a wide range of uses and building types and property types, and what does that mean for the World Heritage area? So that was really to address those issues. But the point is, individual historic districts, if there's something that's really important to you that you don't feel is captured in the citywide guidelines, like type of appropriate fencing or sidewalks and driveways and things like that are really unique to individual districts, then those are best addressed through district-specific guidelines.
And so, for instance, like Monte Vista I guess I don't understand King William and Monte Vista historic districts, because that's what they're not like neighborhoods with a historic district. They're the whole thing is a historic district, correct? I don't know. I've always been wondering.
Yes, it is possible that a neighborhood association might have larger boundaries than the historic district or vice versa. So they're only going to be applicable to like within the designated areas.
So for instance, like Monte Vista, is everything in Monte Vista an historic district? Is a boundary of the neighborhood the same as a boundary of the historic district? And also,
I'll let Paul answer that. I think so, but I need him to confirm. They're very similar, anyways.
Yes, the boundary of the neighborhood historic district is the same as the boundary of the for the district. If I understand your question, Barbara, and also I guess you might note a little bit that when Monte Vista was designated a historic district, there were several neighborhoods that were incorporated into those boundaries. So, like Laurel Heights was one of the neighborhoods. Monte Vista was one of the neighborhoods, and it seemed like there was maybe one other one. So the district boundaries were basically drawn as part of the ordinance that designated Monte Vista as a historic district. I think that's correct, Corey. You might correct me if I'm wrong, but
I think there is a small block on Weesatch or a small portion that may not be in the actual historic district, but yes, they're very similar.
So we've seen like over near Monticello and Jefferson that there's a historic district that crosses into 3 different neighborhoods geographically, correct? Mm-hmm. So when the Monte Vista was done, then it went into, so it took in Laurel Heights neighborhood as part of Monte Vista then, or the Monte Vista Historic District. And they're the same, right? So, interesting. I didn't know that. So I guess the reason I'm asking is that, and like King William also, the whole thing is the whole thing a historic district, all of the King William with geography of the neighborhood association, the same as the historic district?
I think so. I think they're very similar. I can't say for certain. I think there's a portion in King William that is to the west, kind of south of the HEB campus, that isn't quite in the historic district, but might be in the association.
Okay. And then I want to ask another question. So when you look at the number of historic districts, there are how many? 20-something? Right. At the very first slide you had, it's like these
32.
are 32. And then some of those, so some of those are a building, correct?
A district has to be 2 or more properties. And so we do have one, the Leon Springs district, that is 3 properties.
Right.
But generally, besides that one exception, they're larger.
Okay, so remember how Vincent Michael from the Conservation Society, Vincent, I always get dyslexia for me on that name. You remember how he gave the presentation about historic districts, and there were different types of historic districts. Remember, there were 2, I remember 2 different categories. So when you talk about a neighborhood that has many properties versus the 1 to 3, do you know the difference in that type of name for historic district?
I think the difference he's talking about is a national register district versus a local. And so
no, it was something like, like some Latin term for one of them, ensetu or something like that, which I think means all encompassing. I don't know. I just thought that was really interesting. Because like, for instance, when River Road became a historic district, I went and looked at what was in the different ones, and this was like, there are 32, did you say? But like they're only like seemed like fewer that were entire neighbor residential historic districts. And so I was just wondering about that. I've always tried to figure that out, because it's a different game if it's 2 or 3 buildings versus more. So that's why I was wondering.
Yeah, I mean, most of our local districts are going to be under which this would apply. Hundreds, I think like the next smallest is probably Greenlawn or Fulton, which are a couple dozen properties, but most of the residential districts in particular are substantial.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thanks. I just wondered, because I think that, because I had, until the coalition had him come and make that presentation, the first one he did, I had no idea the history of historic districts worldwide. And I don't know, that's if you all weren't, some of you all weren't able to hear it, it's fascinating, the history and worldwide history of historic districts. And I just didn't know that there was, it was just a great presentation as far as I was concerned.
Okay. Well, I think we can wrap up. If there's nothing else, I will end the call.
Okay, Corey, I want to just ask one more thing.
Hold on, a few questions came in.
Okay, sorry. So we can now, for people in our neighborhood that couldn't come today, in our historic district, I should say, that couldn't come today, we can point them to that information you had at the beginning, that these are being recorded that they can watch, correct?
Yes,
Okay,
they
thanks.
are on our website on the About the HCRC page.
Okay.
I think I sent everybody an email, like a reminder email yesterday. It should be linked on there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tom says, I hate to move on from the window.
Corey, I've got one question.
I can't tell who's talking. Is it?
Paul Kennison.
Corey, is it possible, does the city make any of the drafts or the guidelines available in a hard copy anymore? Or is there any kind of mechanism to get a hard copy? My little residential printer just could not print these all, and I'm historic enough that I need to have a hard copy to be able to work.
Yeah, we used to sell them for the cost to make them, which is about $20. We have them printed here at our central services. Let me look if we have any. We might have a couple copies left. They're also at all of the nearby local libraries. And so there's one at the St. Pedro Springs Library, I know. There's one at the Landa. But if you want one at your house, yeah, we can sell it to you.
Yeah, and the drafts too, or just
I'm sorry, what?
can we get a hard copy of the drafts?
Yeah, that's definitely doable.
Okay, how do we go about requesting those?
I mean, you just did. Let me let me make a note, and we'll figure out how to get it to you.
Okay, I don't mind coming down there to pick them up.
There's nobody here. Yeah.
Well, I can go to Stephanie's house. She's almost in my neighborhood.
That's true, Paul, but I don't have a printer. I'm such a millennial.
Well, we'll get it figured out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Somebody else was speaking though before Paul.
Yes. Yeah. I have a question. Are these standards, let's say, equally applied? We've just had recent publicity about tree ordinance, depends who you are. This is historic, is it? I know I live across from a public figure who got a fence when nobody else has a fence. So I'm just wondering how you make sure that you're giving equal treatment as far as these standards.
Yeah, I mean, yes, they're all reviewed the same, and we have really kind of modest homes that go all the time to HCRC and get picked at, and the homeowner's kind of questioning why he's getting picked at when he's next to on the agenda to a house in King William or something like that. I can't guarantee that the outcome is always going to be consistent, but they're definitely they go through the same process. Okay, and then Tom had one question. I hate to move on from the windows question as it is the most often mentioned issue in the Fulton and Linwood Rosewood. What's the process for ensuring adherence to guidelines? Compliance? Is this a code compliance question?
I guess that it may be too broad a question, but we get, I get can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I get a lot of houses are being bought and restored here on Fulton Avenue, especially recently. And almost all of them come in especially with the flippers that buy them. They come in and they put some kind of not aluminum, but metal window to replace the wood sash windows that were there. And then there ensues, HDRC is made aware of that usually and get involved, and that there's a lot of passion among the owners or renovators of the house at what an expense that is. I guess my question is, do you have recommended replacements? A list, say, of the kind of window. I know Pella makes a great replacement window, but it's like you could rebuild your house with what they cost.
Yeah, I mean, we're not window salespeople, remember? So we can certainly point people to the right direction, and we can say, hey, here's one that's been successful, and it appears to be a Pella. You can research and find out, but we don't have like a recommended like window sheet to provide to somebody. We just what we, you know, on the policy document we showed those stipulations, and so what we're saying is, as long as you can find a product that meets all of these requirements, then have at it. But it does so happen that there's 2 or 3 products in particular that tend to meet them every time versus others.
I tend to fall on the side. We restored the windows that we had. We, meaning my husband, did. And they work fine. They are single pane, and they're maybe not as energy efficient, which seems to be the big complaint. I guess that is the thing that just is sort of overwhelming to me, and explaining to people the window that you put in doesn't look like the windows that were originally in this house, and that's why you're getting pushback from HDRC on these windows. Unfortunately, most people tend to proceed with restoration, I'll put that in quotes, before they file any permits. So you have to wait on them to start, or when you notice it and it gets reported, they've already put windows in. So that continues to be an issue. I mean, the specific questions that I want to ask, I can't formulate very well, but dealing with those people get very, a lot of people get very passionate about needing the safety and the energy efficiency of a new window. And I don't know. And there have been some complaints about how HDRC handles that with them. So I don't know if that's just feedback or whether you have a response to that, Corey.
Yeah, it's true. People are very passionate about it, and a lot of times it's because they've been convinced by somebody, a salesperson or a commercial, that this window is going to solve all of their problems. So yeah, and usually they're spending a lot of money. Usually they're spending $30,000 to $40,000 to do their house. So emotions certainly run high. So prevention is key. Obviously, we can't physically stop somebody from going on a Saturday and pulling windows and taking them to the dump, which, you know, so we do rely on reports and we try to get to them when we can. And when that's done, then it does become more difficult to enforce a repair. We can. We have the mechanisms to do that. Like I said, we can always require somebody to go and find salvaged window products and go back in and make it look just like it did. But generally, when that's happened, the HCRC tends to approve some sort of compromise, it does seem. So yeah, it's certainly an issue. And we can spend some time talking about compliance issues at a future session. There's enough material there.
And Corey, there are 2 more questions in the chat box if you want to address them really quickly. One from Scott says, does OHP have a pre-buyer checklist to prevent flippers overpaying and then claiming financial hardship? And then there's also a question from Monica after that.
Oh gosh. I think that is an issue with just somebody not knowing what they're doing. We have a lot of people that buy historic properties all the time and are successful in their rehabs, and we have some that do it all the time and are unsuccessful all the time. It's a matter of kind of learning your lessons, I think. We don't, I mean, again, going back to being proactive, like we do work with realtors, and so we try to encourage people as much as possible. I do think a lot of the quote unquote flippers are aware of us and know how to reach us. They sometimes choose not to. So yeah, it is difficult to kind of get ahead of those cases. What is the question from Monica? I'm sorry, I don't.
A little further up in the chat, it says, may we return to the topic of BOA and the guidelines role in that process? Are you saying if a case receives a COA based on guidelines and HDRC support for the overall project, that's an endorsement for whatever BOA variance might have to be pursued? Do you see that?
So the code says that one of the roles of the HDRC is to be a recommending agency to relevant boards and commissions. And so sometimes if there's a variance request in a historic district or in Rio or some other district where HDRC has purview, then we look for the HDRC to provide a recommendation to that commission. Doesn't mean they have to approve it. It just means it might support the request for variance. Especially for things like setback, where they're really just kind of following or replacing what was there historically. Those tend to be approved. Now, we might be talking about two different things. So there's a variance and then there's appeals. So appeal is a very different process than a variance request. I don't see Monica anymore. She has the scary yellow triangle by her box. So I don't know if she's connected still. Can we unmute you, Monica?
Mute.
There you are. I can hear you.
Yes. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. No, I wasn't sure about that because, and we could take this offline because it will go into more detail. And you did say that you're going to address BOA a little bit more during another section. So if you want to chat about that a little bit later because of the detail, we can. But I was just wondering also in general, when your COA goes over to zoning, do they just take that as a tacit endorsement?
Not always. It helps though. I mean, if you're requesting a variance and it's already gone to one relevant board and commission and they found it to be appropriate, then that's certainly going to help the case.
Mm-hmm.
The BOA is not tasked with reviewing the same factors as the HDRC though.
Okay.
Ever. So
Okay.
either for a variance or for an appeal. So it really is just kind of it's a separate review, but it does help your case if you've got a certificate of appropriateness saying that this went to a public hearing and was determined to be appropriate. Please approve my variance.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say, just a PSA in response to Barbara's question. Healy Murphy is also a really small district, but also check the Conservation Society's website for the next month's regular meeting because Vince is doing his presentation on historic districts again. So that's another way you can catch that.
Barbara, I think you were talking about non-contiguous districts. So, or like multiple property districts, which is a thing. I'm sorry. Can you unmute yourself again?
I remember looking at the list because when promoting becoming a historic district, and I remember that there was like the auditorium, whatever it's called now, Tobin Auditorium, was a historic district. It was under the list of historic districts, and you know, I never quite understood the difference between one building being landmarked and a historic district. That's what I was. I think it was at the beginning of making historic districts.
So I mean, so you're technically there's no difference. I mean, it is a zoning. It is a historic overlay. And there's just two ways to get there, either through a district or through individual landmark designation. And we could probably expound on that a little bit in the next session. Jenny Hay is going to talk about our designations program. It is possible. We have taken like designations as a group before, and there's really no difference in doing a group of individual designations or calling that a district. I mean, it's really the same kind of thing.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we are at time, so thank you everybody for coming, and we will post this to the website when it's downloaded, and let me know in the meantime, just by email or phone call if you have any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yay.
Thank you.